This drug is dangerous. You cannot play with it. It's not funny. It's not something to laugh about. And trying to send that message with clarity that good people don't smoke marijuana.
Every day, every night, all the time. Every day I need an ounce and a half. SP, the only flow that you know, with a bounce and a half. Listen, kid, I need a mountain to cast so I can roll up, hop in the whip and like bounce to the ab. I get high cause I'm in the hood, the guns is around. To take a blunt just to ease the pain and humble me now.
Greetings. Did you know that cannabis is the most commonly utilized federally illegal drug? A recent study showed that over 50 million individuals admitted to having utilized cannabis once. And yet, it is a Schedule I drug on the Controlled Substance Act, deemed as having no medicinal use and a high potential for abuse. In this series of interviews, I speak with experts within the cannabis space. We discuss everything from the public health and the medical concerns to environmental challenges and calls for social justice. There's much to discuss, but even more to learn. Join me on this journey into the emerging cannabis industry. I'm Dr. Tyson Lloyd Gray, and we are here today talking about cannabis law, cannabis economics, and many of the issues and challenges surrounding the emerging industry as it stands today. I'm excited because I have with me an expert in cannabis tax law and the economics of cannabis, specifically pertaining to the reasons that we should think about legalization of cannabis and what that will look like for states as well as the federal government. And so, Ulrik Boesen, if you could just give us a little bit about your background, what you currently do, and how that relates to this emerging cannabis industry.
Absolutely. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to come here. So I've done about 2.5 years of excise tax research for a nonprofit called the Tax Foundation. We're situated here in DC where we are today. I write a lot about excise taxes, not just on cannabis, but on numerous different items and objects. So you probably know excise tax as the tax you pay on gasoline, or the tax you pay on cigarettes, if there's any smokers out there, or the tax you pay on alcohol, probably a lot more if you drink alcohol. That's the kind of tax that we levy when we want to levy a tax on a specific product or a specific kind of activity or transaction. And that's likely to be the kind of tax that we'll see on cannabis. It's the tax that we already see in the states that are legalized, and it's the tax that is being discussed at the federal level as well. So I spent about 3 years researching this area, writing about this area, following sort of developments from the early days of legalization back in 2014 when the first states came online, to today where we have 19 states that are doing recreational cannabis. And I want to say, as a preface, that when I talk about taxation of cannabis, I'm mainly talking about recreational cannabis. So I believe there's a huge difference between medicinal and recreational. And I can get into that a little bit later as it pertains to excise taxation and why a tax should look the way it does. But when I argue for certain taxes, it is about recreational cannabis.
Okay, so let's just simplify for the watchers. When we talk about excise tax, is that a tax that we all pay similar to a sales tax, or is that specifically for growers and industries? Where do we see excise tax within our purchases?
So you might not notice when you pay an excise tax because it is often built into the price. By the time you go and grab your product on the shelf, you'll oftentimes have excise tax built into that price, the sticker price. So the one that we probably have all paid is the gasoline excise tax. Now technically that's being paid early in the value chain. So before it actually gets to the pump, it's already been paid, but it's built into the price. And what the oil company will do is simply pass that tax along to the consumer. It's the same for cigarettes. So at the federal level, the cigarette manufacturers pays an excise tax per 1,000 cigarettes. And then when it comes to the states, the distributor pays the state tax. By the time it gets to retail, 2 taxes have already been paid, but they're just going to pass that tax along to the consumer. So you were paying it, you might not notice that you're paying it. For some states, and cannabis taxes in particular, some states have done an almost a sales tax like excise tax. So what they're saying is, when the consumer comes and purchases an ounce of cannabis, and let's pretend that the cost is $50, they'll say there's going to be a 15% tax on top of that $50. So So that'll be $7.50 on top. Now that's going to be built into the sticker price still, but it's not, you're not liable to pay the tax until it hits retail. That's a lot more like a sales tax. Most excise taxes are paid early in the value chain because the government and the tax collectors like to have fewer taxpayers. So obviously, if you have manufacturers or brewers or distilleries, there are fewer taxpayers than if you have every single retail store in the country collect those taxes for you. Now, the main difference between the sales tax and excise tax is that sales taxes are broad consumption-based taxes. So we're saying we want to tax all your consumption with the same rate.
Okay.
Excise taxes are really specific. So you're saying we only want to tax this particular type of consumption with this particular tax because there are a particular set of negative externalities or societal costs associated with this. So
Gotcha.
gas tax is an example. We're saying there's a cost to driving on the roads. We're going to recover that cost by taxing gasoline because there's a pretty good connection between how much gasoline you purchase and how much you're driving on the road.
Right.
The sales tax is just like the income tax in terms it's just for revenue to
Okay.
have general services paid for. So that's the way we pay for schools and for Medicare and other things like that.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So if the excise tax is specifically levied on certain industries, certain products because of this additional burden, if you would, so specifically with gasoline, what then is the excise tax that's being levied against cannabis actually being spent for?
Yeah, and this is where I think the biggest debate is currently in cannabis.
Okay.
Some people, and a lot of cannabis activists are guilty of this, have talked about legalization as a way to raise government revenue. This is transactions that are already happening, right? People are already purchasing cannabis, they're just doing it in the illicit market. So they're saying, let's move that into a licensed, regulated, and tax market, and there'll be new tax revenue for the government.
Right.
Now, my problem with that argument is why should cannabis consumers pay an additional tax? Unless there is an additional burden associated with that consumption.
Right.
Now, there probably is a slight burden. There's some addiction treatment that people need, similar to alcohol. There might be some DUI concerns. You might have to train police officers to recognize what does it look like when someone's driving high, to make sure no one's putting anyone else at risk. But those burdens are relatively small and much more comparable to alcohol than to anything else. So that's the conversation. Like,
Okay.
why do we levy this tax in the first place? And if you figured out why you're doing it, then you got to figure out how much you may need to raise. Now, this is a sort of special tax in that there's a different topic when we're talking about cannabis that we don't have with the other taxes. Because of the war on drugs, there's been this sort of, there's a lot of victims of the war on drugs. And what I want to say is, I think there's an understanding both in the cannabis business and among cannabis consumers that some of the tax revenue, they're willing to pay some taxes that can then be reinvested into communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. Now, this is a special situation, but that can absolutely work too. And a lot of states are doing that. So they're basically saying, we're going to tax you a little bit more, raise a little bit more revenue, so we can put millions of dollars into communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. Now, that's not necessarily a negative externality associated with consuming cannabis. That's more negative externality associated with the prohibition of cannabis.
Right.
But I think there's this acceptance that for this particular product, that's something we want to do as a society. That doesn't exist in the alcohol conversation. Doesn't
Okay.
exist with gasoline. Doesn't exist with any other excise tax that we have today. But cannabis is kind of special in that regard.
Okay, so that's interesting as well, because I think in my mind, I just assumed that all the tax was raising revenue for the state, and then the state was going to essentially allocate that ideally towards state good, right?
Yeah.
Governmental good. That's air quotes. So if the state tax is just to raise revenue, right? Are you in support then of the excise tax that would redress the war on drugs, that would reinvest in certain communities? And for those who aren't, I guess, what is the pushback against that? If you have a state tax if you have a sales tax that is going to raise revenue for the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the pushback then for an excise tax that would redress specifically Black and brown communities that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs?
I don't think I haven't seen much pushback against those kind of taxes, honestly.
Okay.
I've seen some pushback against certain states that have come out a little aggressive on the rate.
Okay.
I've seen some pushback against states that maybe are saying they're doing something and then they're not really doing it. And what I mean by that is, let's say a state says, we're gonna put it into a fund, we call it a cannabis fund, where all the tax money's gonna go in, we're gonna spend more on schools. Now, schools is maybe one good way to reinvest into communities. Say there's certain underfunded schools, we're gonna give them more money. Now, the issue is, it is very easy for the state to take some of the regular funding away from the general fund. So they're not really spending more.
Right.
Then the revenue's just coming from a different source.
Right.
So those are some of the issues that we've seen. So saying they're doing something, not really doing it, just redirecting, fudging the numbers a little bit,
Yeah.
that's a problem. And then there's a problem when the rates become too big. Like if you have too many ideas, but what do you want to do with all this great new cannabis revenue?
Yeah.
Then you get, your California situations where tax rates are too high for legal businesses to actually thrive and survive and compete with the illicit market.
Okay, which is the other segue I wanted to make, right? So there's a lot of conversation about the benefits of legalizing cannabis. I mean, first there's just the decriminalization. So when you think about the money spent for, prisons and the war spent on, policing communities, right? So that's one argument. But then when you get into the actual benefit of the taxes, when you get into job creation, right? These are all things that people can get excited around and kind of think of as like, a benefit to the industry.
Yeah.
Why is it that you think in California, where we've seen, one of the first states to legalize cannabis, that has probably some of the most robust laws, specifically when you think about like going through the courts around the industry, the vast majority of that industry is still underground, right? So you don't really see people, getting the licenses and trying to actually be above board in terms of the industry.
So I think it's a little bit of the sum of the problems in California are greater than the individual parts. And what I mean by that is you could probably have a successful licensed market with a high tax rate if it's cheap to run the business, if it's easy to get a license, if it's easy to open a store. In California, there's sort of a multitude of problems. The tax rate's fairly high. It's not the highest, but it's fairly high. But then you add, it's really hard to get a license. So there's not enough licenses. So you're asking people, and now I'm going to bring in another topic, but you're asking people who cannot access capital in the normal way to pay a lot of money to get a license. And then in California, it's also so that localities can ban cannabis operations in that locality. And 3/4 of localities have done that.
Oh, wow.
So it's hard to get a license, it's expensive to get a license. You cannot access capital because of federal prohibition. So you have to come with your own money and risk your own money to do this. If you then get a license, it's very limited where you can open the store. If you then succeed in opening the store, you're going to be paying very high taxes, and you're going to have to sell at higher prices than your illicit competitors. When you add to that in California for the last, I guess, almost 30 years, you've had sort of this gray market where medicinal cannabis has been legal, and somewhat recreational has been, if not legal, but at least accepted. And there's a mindset change that needs to happen where you're saying the guy who's been operating a store fairly out in the open, but haven't had a license, haven't paid taxes, haven't, done all the things you have to do to be compliant with state laws, you're gonna have to start cracking down on these people if you want the licensed guys to survive. And there's a contradiction there for me, is when you put that many burdens on the licensed guys, you can't then not make sure that the unlicensed guys are able to continue. But that's not the purpose of this reform. The purpose is decriminalization. So I think for me, and I think that's where taxes play such a big role, is if decriminalization is what you want to achieve, then don't come at it from a point of view of look at all this great revenue. Come at it from the completely opposite sides of how do we convert most of the activity that's currently happening in the illicit space into the licensed space. That sort of dictates what you're going to do then. You're going to try and make it cheap. You're going to have ample licenses. You're going to make sure that there's capital available and all these things. Yeah. And that's just not the case in California today, which is why it's so difficult.
Yeah. I definitely can see the different approaches being significant in terms of how policies are created. So we're talking a lot about the taxes and how these particular industries are being taxed. And I think one of the questions that came up to me when I was initially doing some of this reading, and I think I was unaware to the extent that these quote unquote illegal operations, right, still have to pay taxes, right? Mm-hmm. So I definitely want to get into that and just kind of talk about how I think it's section 280E of the, is it the tax code?
Federal tax code,
That,
yeah.
that essentially says that these industries still have to pay taxes on illegal funds, right, illegal activities, and yet they're not able to write off the expenses like a normal business
Yep.
would. So if you could just say a little bit about that, and perhaps is that something that you think is also keeping some of these industries underground because perhaps they're not really getting the benefit of getting the license and being able to then, you know, write off the expenses that come along with most businesses.
Absolutely. So we all know that in the first few years of a business, you're likely to not make a profit.
Right.
Most businesses, the few businesses that survive can survive because they can write off their expenses. So even though they might have a lot of expenses, not that much income, they can write off those expenses, you know, until they finally turn an income and can pay income taxes. Now, back in the, I think it's the 80s, I'm not 100% certain of the year, but during the height of the war on drugs, they arrested a drug dealer, and they wanted to get him not just for dealing drugs, but also for tax evasion. Now, this guy was clever, so he said, well, I'm gonna write off my car, my boat, expenses I had to all my dealers on the street, all their phones and all the whatnot. And the court said, well, you can, right? That was the law, you could.
Sounds like most millionaires today, right?
So the federal government said, wait, we can't have that. So they put into a targeted ad drug kingpins. What that means today is if you're a licensed state legal cannabis retailer or distributor or even cultivator, you cannot write off your normal expenses, which is driving up your effective rate. So if you're turning, you know, have small margins, and normally you'll be able to write off your expenses and maybe still turn a profit, that's not gonna happen for you. Because your cost for employees, for lighting, for shelves, and all these things that you normally, you know, just write off because it's business expenses.
Right.
The federal government said, no, you can't do that. And it's just sort of a relic because the federal government's not kept pace with the states. And that's obviously a major problem. There's several lawsuits every year where businesses are saying this can't be right, discriminatory behavior. One made it to the Supreme Court this year. So far, the federal government has continued to do this, and the courts have accepted it. It's one of the most important reasons why federal reform would be such a positive thing for the cannabis market, because they would have equal treatment. And they would, I think, open the door for a lot more people to get into this space. Because the truth of the matter is you've now created a situation, you have all these state markets, because it's federally prohibited. If I cultivate it in California, I can't sell to Oregon, right? Or I can't
Right.
sell to Nevada. So everything must happen within state. Now that puts a limit on the capital available. And if you don't have access to capital, which most people that we would like to see get into the cannabis space don't have,
Right.
how are they gonna do it?
Yeah.
And as long as this situation continues, it's gonna be people who can come with their own capital, who can open a store, who have that, you know, sort of pillow that they can handle the federal taxes for a while until their business is growing enough that they can actually turn a profit.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're just gonna see this, that some people throw all their money into this, and 2 years later, they're gonna have to close that store with a major loss.
Right. Right.
Because of the difficulties of operating in this space as long as there's federal prohibition. So that's really tough. And then when you have that situation, that's why it's so important that state lawmakers understand the operating environment of cannabis businesses when they design their taxes, because they're going to put that on top, right? So yes, there's been billions of dollars of sales, but it's so hard to operate a business. You can't just look at it like holistically and say this market is growing, we can just tax it. No, you can't just tax it, because there's individual people, entrepreneurs that want to succeed in this space. If you have a 30, 40%, 50% tax on top of these difficulties that we just went over, how are they going to survive?
Yeah, yeah. So aside from the fact that cannabis is, you know, technically legal, right? Substance 1, drug on the controlled substance list. So we know that there are those additional burdens that businesses face. But let's just say theoretically, right, there was legalization on the federal level tomorrow. Are there any legitimate reasons that cannabis would not be taxed the exact same as alcohol and tobacco? Is there a reason that it would have a different structure or a different way that you would go about thinking about the taxation of the industry?
Yeah, I think there are differences. I like to think of cannabis more like alcohol than tobacco, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
So the reason we do excise tax, I said before, is to account for some negative externality or some societal cost associated with consumption. So we got to find out what's the best tax base, like what's the best box for this.
Okay.
For tobacco, it's easy. The amount of tobacco you smoke, the more tobacco you smoke, the more the harm, right? So we're just going to tax the amount of tobacco. The same for alcohol. The amount of alcohol you consume, you know you're going to get more drunk, you're going to get more violent, you're more likely to get in the car or
Yeah.
whatever else. So we're going to tax the amount of alcohol you drink. The same for gasoline. The more gasoline you purchase, the more you're going to drive on the roads. We're going to tax the amount of gasoline.
Interesting.
So for cannabis, it's a little more difficult. Because what is the harm creating agent if there is one? Now, some would say it's the intoxication. So saying that the more THC you consume, if that makes you go, higher or more intoxicated, that's what we should tax. That's what New York State has done. They said we want to get after the intoxication. We're mostly worried about things like DUIs.
Okay.
So they said we're going to tax the milligram of THC. So that's one way to think about it. Others have thought, let's do the amount of cannabis you consume. Because smoking and eating it, whatever else, that's likely to be the harm causing agent. So we're going to tax it by weight. Say, per ounce of cannabis, there's going to be a tax. Like Alaska has done that, for instance. Most states have sort of foregone this question, which I think is problematic, but they've said, we can't deal with this right now. There's thousands of different cannabis products out there. We can't design a simple tax, right? We can't just say by volume like we do for alcohol. Because yes, you can get cannabis as a drinkable solution. You can also get it as a smokable one, or vape pen, or something you put on your skin. So they've said the only thing they have in common is that people purchase them for US dollars. So let's just tax the selling price. Now I think that's problematic because the amount you pay for your cannabis has no association with the harm created. So whether I purchase a really expensive chocolate bar with THC in it or a really cheap chocolate bar with THC in it doesn't really have any effect on the harm associated with me consuming that.
Okay.
And plus, there's the big what if federal legalization. If that were to happen tomorrow, and you all of a sudden opened up a whole country for cannabis sales, I don't think it's too much crazy prediction to say that the prices would fall pretty rapidly. We'd all of a sudden be able to grow it all in Southern Oregon where it grows really easily,
Right.
and then ship it all over the country. You'd all of a sudden open the capital markets. You'd all of a sudden get rid of 280E, right? There's just so many costs that would come down so significantly that prices would fall. And if I based my tax system on prices, my revenue is going to nosedive. So from a sort of stability point of view, quantity is just superior.
Okay.
So both from my perspective, both because that's how we always do the excise tax, almost always do excise tax, we say quantity is the better base. Because it has shared association with the harm causing agent, and because it guarantees more stability, I think quantity is the way to go.
Okay.
Now, I've been losing that battle. Unfortunately, a lot of retailers and distributors and importers like the simplicity of just doing price. They already have to collect sales taxes in most states.
Okay.
So they already have the system. So for them to add 5% on top, it's not a big compliance burden.
Right.
I want to come in with a system that's much more expensive to deal with, because
Yeah.
whether it's weight, whether it's THC, it's going to require testing and a lot of other things. But I think like long term, that would be the way to go, is quantity.
Okay. Yeah. That I can see the challenge because you're right. With alcohol, it's liquid, so it's gonna be the same volume regardless, right?
Very easy.
And when you get into cannabis, because you have so many uses, right? You can put it in butter and then make products with it. You can put it in candies. You can smoke it. You can, you name it. But I think, just thinking on the fly here, I think I actually agree with your argument, probably from an environmental perspective. So if you want to add that into your your reasoning while you're making your policy argument, because it seems that, at least from some of my readings, it's a water intensive crop, right? And so there are environmental impacts that comes from its growth and its volume. So you could argue that the excise tax is offsetting some of the environmental concerns around production.
Absolutely. I think it's an interesting topic, the environmental aspects. It's one of the arguments that I've seen for why federal legalization is a must, and while when you do it, you must open up for interstate commerce. Because the cost of growing cannabis in a state like Alaska is intense.
Yeah.
And the environmental impact of building greenhouses and light in Alaska is, we would never grow cucumbers in Alaska, but because of federal prohibition, they have to grow cannabis in Alaska, but then sell it in Alaska.
Yeah.
That's probably not very smart from an environmental point of view. And I saw a crazy statistic, I think it was about Massachusetts, there's something like 10% of industrial electricity consumption is all cannabis growth.
Wow.
Which is wild, but it is very intensive. When you want to get high THC product, which is what's most popular, you need to own the light. And there's not that much natural light in a state like Massachusetts, so you have to build a greenhouse and just blast it. And it requires a lot of electricity, and so probably better to grow it in California,
Yeah.
where the sun's always shining, or Arizona, where the sun's always shining, and then take it from there. But that's a whole different conversation. I just thought it was interesting how we're on the environmental aspects.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'm always thinking about the environmental concerns and challenges, specifically when it comes to crops, and that's actually my introduction into cannabis, was thinking about pesticide use and things like that. So I definitely think that that is a concern. And thinking about, I guess, the space of what are the concerns around cannabis? I know a lot of times it just kind of gets pushed as there's no harm to this product and we should just legalize it. But there are some viable public health concerns, and individuals who have brought up some of the issues with perhaps vaping, specifically with the youth, right? What are your thoughts around that? I know it's not necessarily an economic argument, but what are some of your thoughts around individuals who are concerned with the vaping aspect, or some of the negative potential of legalizing? I think we agree that there's a strong economic argument, but how do you respond to individuals on that front?
No, absolutely, and I think we have to accept, first of all, that this consumption is already happening. And I see some people saying we should maintain prohibition because we don't want people to use this product. And that's a false choice. Right? That's not a thing we can do. We saw it with prohibition. We've tried this before. So you can't do alcohol, you did it anyway. So that's my starting point. Then that's the knowledge of what this does to people is limited. Because federal prohibition has limited the amount of studies and research that's been done. So we just don't know very well. But it's certainly a trade-off you need to figure out. And taxes play a role in that, where you say, we want it to be cheap enough that people who currently consume cannabis but purchase it in the illicit market switch over. We want it to be expensive enough that everyone doesn't, run down and try it. I don't know what that price level is, but that's a trade-off that, when you develop a tax system, you need to figure out where is that level. That's what we're currently seeing, that same debate in the nicotine vaping space. They're saying we're introducing tax on vaping products because we want to make sure that this doesn't become a gateway to nicotine addiction for a whole new generation. We want to do that while you're still protecting adults' ability to purchase the product, so you don't push them out to an illicit market. Right. Very similar problems, very difficult answers.
Yeah. Would there be a similar argument regarding the taxing of cannabis around just decriminalization in and of itself? Do you have any numbers, I guess, right? So think about, I know a lot of states now have annual numbers of how many millions or billions they made from taxes, right, from the industry. Are there currently any numbers around just decriminalization in and of itself and what kind of revenue that puts back into the government?
There is, from the federal government looked at it.
Okay.
So the MORE Act, which was introduced by Representative Nadler about a year and a half ago and passed the House, they did a score where they looked at a 5% tax. What would that create in revenue? But they also looked at what would it create in savings. I think the total was about $14 billion over 10 years.
Okay.
That is to say, a rounding error in the federal government. Now, for me, that doesn't mean that much because it's not really, my concern is not really what the federal government can save, more so how it could possibly impact people.
Okay.
Now, they don't account for what does it look like when massive billion-dollar a year industry who's currently not taxed with the income tax, with sales taxes, with whole income taxes. What does that look like in tax generation?
Yeah.
They have no idea, and honestly, no one does, what that looks like. There's some predictions saying we're looking at a $60 billion a year industry, which is huge.
Yeah.
If they're all paying, if they're hiring hundreds of thousands of people that are paying the wage income tax, if every single transaction has a sales tax, if they're paying property taxes, if they're paying corporate income taxes, then there's a lot of tax revenue out there.
Yeah.
But that's less relevant for me to that specific industry because those are product-based taxes. That's just saying you're fostering an environment where a new industry can prosper, and that's obviously going to have someone fall for the government.
Right.
I say this to say I don't think revenue is the right frame of mind
Okay.
for neither state lawmakers nor federal government, federal lawmakers when they're looking at this issue. I've seen most lawmakers talking about it have understood this. Now, they're not doing this because they want to raise an additional couple $2 billion a year. They're doing this because they think the war on drugs has failed, and it's pointless to keep prohibiting consumption of this product. And then there's some added benefits of new jobs, more revenue, all these things. But that means, so we had, Nadler's bill, I think, was a 5% tax. We just had Representative Mace, who's a Republican from South Carolina, with a 3% tax. So you're seeing that kind of mentality that is, let's come in low.
Right.
And let this market develop and prosper. And then, who knows what it's gonna look like a decade or 15 years from now. But if it's well established, maybe you consider that you should tax it more. But I think it's very important to come in low.
Okay.
Because we don't know really what it's gonna take in the States to beat the illicit market. The illicit market's been around for, 80, 90 years. They're well established. They have a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they can sell this product really cheaply. So you want to make sure that the legal products are competitive.
Got you. So if the argument is, if the motivating argument is not centered around revenue, right? I completely get the social justice and just kind of like moral argument of why we decriminalizing something that is safer than other products that are legalized, right? And I think most people agree that cannabis is safer than tobacco in terms of health and safer than alcohol in terms of harm caused to other individuals, right? And so if we have those products that are legalized, obviously there's a strong argument for legalizing cannabis. When I think about the economics of it, I tend to think about the revenue, right?
Yeah.
And specifically around the job creation, right? So that's really one of the large pushes that we hear from, Senator Booker, and I think he recently introduced a bill as well.
Yeah.
And so the idea that this is going to create jobs and this is going to be, beneficial to those communities that have been disproportionately impacted, right? If that's not the strongest argument, or maybe that is the strongest argument, but I guess my question is, what is your alternative to the revenue argument that would make it beneficial to bring it above ground, since there isn't currently a lot of push to actually criminalize, right? So we're not in the era of the war on drugs. So even when you gave the $14 billion, I'm thinking, oh wow, that's it. But then I thought about, well, right now you don't really have the federal government dispatching individuals to go and find out who has cannabis, right? So they probably aren't investing a lot.
Nope.
And so then the savings are less to decriminalize because you're not really working to, enforce that law.
Absolutely.
But it seems like the greater argument is once you open up that legalization, right, now you have this flourishing industry, ideally, if you create the policies right, and you have this potential for, large job growth. I think I read a quote recently that the cannabis industry is the largest job growing industry, in the country right now.
Yeah.
And so what would be the alternative to a revenue-based argument for legalization?
Well, I think jobs is a great argument. I just wouldn't attach it to revenue, because even if it does create thousands of jobs, I doubt that it would be that meaningful in the bottom line of the federal government.
Okay.
Now, Senator Booker's bill, for all the positives in it, also has a tax rate of over 20%. So I think there's some discrepancy between how he presented what he had introduced.
And explain what that means when you say a tax rate of over 20%.
So at the or at the cultivation level, every product would be taxed at 20. I think it would end at 28% of its value.
Okay.
So basically, you're saying at the first level, we're going to hike up prices by 28%
For the growers.
for the growers.
Okay.
28% is a lot.
Okay.
It wouldn't be a lot if there wasn't already state taxes in place. Like 28 is probably fine, but state of California already has effective rates over 50%. State of Washington already has over 50. State of Washington already has effective rates over 40. You can't just add another layer of really high tax on top of that and expect nothing bad to happen.
This is like living in New York City.
Yeah.
We have New York City tax, New York State tax,
Yep.
the federal tax.
That's exactly the same, and these things compound.
Yeah.
So if you increase prices, early in the value chain, and you have state levels that are levied based on price, you're going to end up taxing a tax, and it's just going to make it really expensive. So that was my main concern with that bill. But I do think jobs is a great. You can create thousands of jobs. They don't know that it will do that. They're hoping it will do that.
Right.
But to get there, you really got to consider the burden that you're then putting on the growers, distributors, and the retailers. And federal legalization doesn't just mean we're not going to make it like milk and you can buy it down at Giant or whatever.
Right.
It's going to be heavily regulated. In the Senate bill from the three Democrats, it's going to be regulated a little bit more like tobacco. So the FDA will get involved. Now, no one's answered the question, what does that mean for medicinal cannabis? If you have the FDA involved. You're not going to be allowed to call anything medicinal if it hasn't gone through its three-phase approval process, which costs millions of dollars, which basically would wipe out the medicinal market day one. Gone. That question hasn't been answered. Right? Are you going to tax the products that are today not taxed in many states because they're medicinal? It would, because they would not be considered medicinal from the federal government. They would be considered recreational.
Yeah.
Or do you have to create this sort of in-between, almost like therapeutical market that's not really medicinal and not really recreational, and
Yeah.
give them some kind of special treatment? Just because that's the situation that we have today. This market exists, FDA has not been involved, if you're all of a sudden involved in, that's, I don't think anyone's answered that question. So it's just me saying, yes, it can create thousands of jobs. Yes, it can create some revenue. But really, the questions that need to be answered first is, how do we convert as much illicit consumption as possible into legal consumption?
Okay.
That question's not been answered. That would be, if you do that, then everything else is just a positive side effect.
Gotcha.
Because then you get jobs, you get revenue, and you get, less involvement of law enforcement because everything is above board.
Right.
And then the other thing is, that's probably some positive to regulation. You don't know when you go to your dealer today what is in the product. If you go to a dispensary that's legalized and regulated, you can ask the guy,
Right.
and he has to tell you the truth. And like states have instituted like testing regimes where they'll come out and test what's in the product, make sure they don't use certain pesticides that are not legal, the THC level correspond to what they say there's in them, so that the consumer can have an experience that they expect.
Right.
That's probably a major positive because that's going to limit the harm, right? So if you get a brownie and you eat that brownie, you want to know that there's only enough THC that you thought in there because you want to have a good experience.
You definitely want to make sure you
Yeah.
can control your THC intake.
And I'm sure there are lots of dealers out there that are pretty good at this, but dispensaries, when everything's out in the public and legalized, it's going to be easier to make sure. And I think that's obviously going to be very positive for the consumers to know what's in their products. And plus product innovation. I mean, we've always seen it. Right? You have salsa water with cannabis, you have topicals with cannabis.
Yeah.
I mean, every day it seems like new products are coming out.
This is true.
That's great.
Yeah, it definitely, and from an environmental standpoint, the industry definitely is regulation because when you think about pesticide use for products that are inhaled as opposed to digested, that's like a whole nother area, right? So you mentioned earlier that all of this is, everything that you're saying about taxes is applying to recreational taxes. Mm-hmm. So what is your stance on medicinal marijuana? How would you recommend that be taxed, or should it be taxed, or should it be covered under a 100% healthcare bill if we could ever get that through, right?
So I don't want to say that this covers everything that's considered medicinal today, but the easy answer is if something is medicinal, it shouldn't be taxed at all.
Okay.
Just because, and to go back to what I said earlier, is the reason we levy these excise taxes is we want to recover the cost associated with harm or with some kind of use. There is no harm to medicinal cannabis because the doctor has said you will be better off if you consume this.
Yeah.
So there is no harm associated, so there should be no excise tax. That's the easy answer. A little more difficult answer has to do with some medicinal products today are probably not really medicinal. They're probably more recreational. So I think a process needs to be developed for what does medicinal actually look like in the future. And then once you have that process, then you can easily exempt those products from taxation because there's no argument for taxing in the first place.
Right. Yeah, I guess that is a challenge. I think a lot of this goes back to just the terrible legal landscape that we're currently in because you can't really do the type of research to find out medicinal uses and things like that because of the fact that you don't have the federal backing and to really find out, right? So definitely a difficult space to be in. I think it's great that we have you in this space. So I kind of want to come back to your job and the work that you do. Do you actually suggest policies? Or are you just analyzing and critiquing policies? What is your role in this industry, and how do you see yourself pushing it forward? And are you, on the ground making suggestions for states that are legalizing in terms of their tax structure? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we are a 401c3, which means we're not a lobby shop. We don't lobby at all.
Okay.
What we do is we're more of a pull organization. So what I will do is I will write, publish analysis of proposals, but also of recommendations for how to think about these things. So I spend a lot of time talking about trade-offs in tax policy and saying, if you do it this way, this is the potential consequences. If you do it that way, this is the potential consequences. Now, the benefit of that is we'll then have lawmakers come to us and ask us questions. And that's when we can engage. So if a state is thinking about doing this, we'll often get a call and say, how should we think about taxing these products? Because state lawmakers, to be completely honest, they work 3 to 4 months a year. They have other jobs.
Right.
They handle hundreds of cases a year of different bills, like legalization, regulation. They have no chance of understanding everything in depth.
Right.
So they need the help from the outside. And that's what we try and play and say, you can do it this way, or you can do it that way. This is the negative effects of this, or this is the positive effects of that. So that's where we're trying to play. We do the same at the federal level.
Okay.
Obviously, lawmakers, they have a lot more staff and they're a lot better prepped. So we work more directly with staff at the federal level because they'll have a staffer who's kind of dedicated to cannabis.
Right.
And they'll ask questions about how does this state do that and what does that mean for that and things like that. So we do spend a lot of time sort of out of the house trying to help
Okay.
shape policy. And then when we're not doing that, then I'm doing analysis and publications.
Got you. Now I know a lot of federal policy actually is state policy that was already tried and proven, and they say, hey, this works, we'll just adopt it, right?
Yeah.
Are there any states right now that you feel have got it right, are just doing like a really good job in terms of how they're doing the excise tax, but then also in terms of where the funds are going?
Yeah.
Right? Is anyone on the right track?
There's a few, I think, that are on the right track. What we can see so far, because it's been a market in growth, so it's a little hard to see how the tax impacts certain things. Like we can see in California that the burdens are too high. We can see in Washington, on the other hand, that also has a really high tax, and the burdens are not too high.
Okay.
And that's what I meant before when I said like the sum of the issues can be greater than the individual problem. Like I think that Washington tax is too high, but they still are successful in converting consumption. That's because it's easy to get a license and it's cheap to run a store and it's cheap to vote. So their costs are not as high and they compete. They also didn't have as well established an illicit market as California did, so there's less competition. So Washington's done a really good job, even though they have a high tax. Colorado's done a really good job. They're also some of the earliest adopters. So I think and we'll probably see the same in California, we just gotta give it a little bit longer, like they'll eventually figure it out.
Right.
I think New York, which came on board with the THC tax, I'm really excited to see how that works out. Because that's something we haven't seen before. And I wanna see how that impacts the market. Does that have a positive effect on the amount of THC that people consume. Like, if you're interested in limiting that, does that kind of tax work?
So they're only taxing the THC.
They're taxing millions of THC.
Interesting. So I never thought about that. Now that almost sounds like a way to also, in terms of you saying medicinal usage should not be taxed. That sounds like kind of a way, because to my understanding, CBD is
The CBD
more
is,
so
yeah,
the medicinal.
True, but then you have a state like Oklahoma, which is only medicinal, which is basically recreational.
Okay.
But they just weren't ready to call it recreational, so they call it medicinal, but everyone can get a card and everyone
Right.
can purchase whatever they want.
I guess I'm thinking on a federal level, if there was a federal tax on THC, which is the component that gets you high,
Yeah,
it seems like that would be more leaning towards the recreational use, whereas the CBD would be more.
I think that's true for certain kinds of products, but I think for other, the THC is really important for the effect that the patient's looking for.
Okay, so perhaps for pain or
Yeah,
something, you
yeah.
need that THC, which is still
That's my understanding.
medicinal
Yeah.
component.
So-
Okay.
As I said, in New York, they've really been focused on intoxication, that's what they wanted to tax. Now,
Right.
they also want to accept medicinal products, so it's not going to harm anyone. But it's a difficult one, right? I mean, you can think about the cannabis market a bit like the smokables. You can maybe tax them a bit more like you do tobacco and say weight. It's very easy to weigh,
Yeah.
a joint and say what goes away. And then everything that is extracted looks a lot more like alcohol. And then maybe there you tax on THC. I mean, that's been my recommendation for the federal government. So you gotta consider these distinctly different types of products. And say, you can even make more categories and say, okay, you have your edibles, you have your vapes, you have your oils, and your other things. Say there's a tax rate per milligram THC in each kind of these products. And then for your smokables, you'll say, we'll do weight.
Okay.
That's one way to do it. But what to do with medicinal?
Okay.
It's really difficult. No one's answered that question because we don't know what medicinal's going to look like in the event of federal legalization.
Right.
Because the FDA is just sort of hanging there. No one knows what should their involvement be. There is another agency, TTB, which regulates alcohol. Used to regulate tobacco too, but there was President Obama moved it into FDA because everyone realized how harmful it is, and they thought maybe the FDA is a better regulator. So there's this kind of question: who will regulate cannabis? Should it be TTB, make it look more like an alcohol market?
Okay.
Should it be FDA, make it look more like a tobacco market?
Okay. Interesting.
That's going to be really important where it lands.
Or the USDA should probably be in that conversation
will,
too,
they will.
because it is, it's an edible product.
Yeah, there's that, and then there is the Department of Agriculture,
Yeah.
which, and I haven't done much ag policy, but I understand that it is highly contentious. And that's another question that no one's answered.
Right. Right.
Crop insurance for cannabis growers, for instance. I'm not going to speak to that.
Yeah, because right now there is none.
There
right?
is none.
You can't insure it.
Exactly.
Wow.
But will people who grow corn and soybean think, that's a great idea to expand the kind of products that you can grow that your crop insurance? Will they think, heck no.
Yeah.
Like states that maybe don't want to legalize. So in all the federal proposals, they've opened the door for states to say, we want to stay dry.
Okay.
Similar to what you did after Prohibition. We said, we're going to legalize the federal level, but if a state really wants to keep it illegal, you
Yeah,
can.
it's not in their state.
Would that state be happy to pay into crop insurance? Just to say,
Gotcha.
legalization sounds like something you can just do. But we have like 3 bills that are over 100 pages long, and they've answered like 20% of the questions.
That would arise.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, I do think you just got to jump in, right?
No, I
It's you're not going to figure out all of the kinks. Some of them you're going to learn along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why what I said before is like all these promises that we're hearing from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. I would be very cautious making those promises.
Right.
Exactly, because it's going to be a little bit walking in blind and seeing what's going to happen. and whether it'll be the success that we all hope it's going to be.
Yeah. Is there a economic argument for no tax? I mean, we have a handful of states that have no state tax, right?
Yeah.
So is there an argument to just say, make it legal and let the industry flourish?
I think there could be. I mean, as I said, the tax revenue that they projected at the federal level is a rounding error. It's peanuts. So if the projections were that not having a tax would move more consumption, which would generate more jobs,
Right,
more
right.
taxes that way, absolutely there could be. Now, because of the way 280 works today, they're overtaxing every legal business.
Right.
Getting rid of 280 will have a little bit of a revenue impact.
Okay.
I suspect that at the very least, the federal government's gonna make sure that they make that back through an excise tax mechanism. There's not gonna be a very high rate one, but I think that's the floor.
Okay.
I don't think there's any chance that we're gonna get legalization or the end of prohibition without an excise tax.
Okay. And does that seem strange to you from a I guess tax perspective that the government would actually tax illegal activities?
It's kind of common, actually.
Is it?
Yeah. So a lot of states have taxes on all illicit drugs, not just on the dealer, but the actual drug was taxed. So you can theoretically go down to a Department of Revenue in the state and say, I have sold, or I'm planning to sell this amount of coke. I need some tax stamps. And the reason it's like that is they would like to, when they get you, if they can't prove necessarily everything that they know can be done, they want to get you for tax evasion too.
Got you.
So that's why it's there. So it's
But
actually
they're gonna always get you for tax evasion because you're never gonna go and
You're
say,
never gonna go in there.
I'm doing something illegal, let me pay the taxes on it.
But they actually did make tax stamps and they're quite cool, so you should go Google them. Different states have different motifs and they're very cool. So it's not that uncommon, like if I'm, steal something and sell it, I'm supposedly liable for taxes on my income from that transaction.
Wow.
Right? All income is taxed, regardless of how you make it.
Right,
So
right.
it's not that uncommon.
Now, how do you, I don't know if you do, advising for individuals and income tax companies, that's in your wheelhouse?
Nope.
Okay, because I'm wondering, how does that legal conversation go where you've got to say you need to file taxes
Yeah.
on this illegal activity because that's your fiduciary duty,
Yeah.
but yet, if they don't, right, that seems like a very,
I don't know how it happens in real life. I assume that's why there's so much money laundering going on, because you need to move all that cash into something that looks legal.
looks legit, right?
Yeah.
It's a setup. Interesting. Okay, so I think we're coming to our closing time. I do want to, since I have you here, you're the expert, I would love to hear, currently with where we are today,
Mhm.
with tax laws, with the federal government, you name it, what are 2 or 3 policy recommendations or suggestions that you think would help in terms of states legalizing cannabis? What are some of the things that they should think about? What are some of the policies that they should put in place, at the very least, while we still are dealing with this treacherous landscape?
Yeah, I think number one for me is understanding the market that their new legal market will be competing with. So legalizing in Illinois is not going to be the same as legalizing in Kentucky. And it's very important that strong lawmakers understand that, because that's going to determine what is the burden they can put on their licensed market.
Okay.
Then the next step is, said before, figure out your tax base. Most have just, sort of punted this question down the road and said, we're going to do a sales tax, light tax, because that's simple. I don't think simplicity is good in this situation, because we are looking at not federal legalization soon necessarily, but it will come. And then the impact on the market at that point. You'll need to change your taxes anyway, because the price-based tax won't work in that situation. So might as well get it right from the beginning. And then third is revenue, right? It's not going to be hundreds of millions of dollars that you can spend on whatever you want. The most successful state is Colorado, and they're raising less than 1% of their own source revenue.
Oh, wow.
It's some money, but it's not going to be like, oh, we'll get rid of income tax, something like that. There's a little bit of money to play around with. I think it's very important that everything is earmarked, right? We're asking cannabis consumers to pay a tax above and beyond the normal consumption tax, the sales tax. There should be a reason for that. And consumers and taxpayers should know what the reason is. So the best way to do that is to do a fund, specific fund, where all the money goes in, and then you have some projects. So I think probably important to spend money on youth prevention. Probably important to spend money on making sure that police officers can recognize what someone looks like when they're driving under the influence. Probably important to invest a lot of money in communities. Those would be the three number one things. So figure out, what you're dealing with, figure out your tax rate, and then figure out what you're gonna do with the money. It's not a lot, but there's gonna be some. I mean, $100 million in the right place can make a big difference, right?
Right.
So even if it's not gonna revolutionize what happens in the state, it can be revolutionary to the community. And making sure that money is earmarked so it doesn't flow into the general fund and disappear, that's crucial.
Yeah, I definitely co-sign the earmarking so that we know where the funds are going and they're not, next thing you know, being used for travels and salary increases.
No one knows where general fund money goes.
Right, no. So thank you very much for that. Hopefully, some of the policymakers or future policymakers are able to see that and also able to read a lot of the work that you're putting out, with your think tank and the work that you're doing here. So definitely appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me and just kind of share more about the taxes and the economics around this particular industry. And this is Ulrik Boesen, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you for having me. You can find me on Twitter at @uboesen, where I do tweet a lot about cannabis. So if you're interested in the topic, go in there and find me. And also, I have links to all my stuff in there.
I'll have to follow you. I think we're just on LinkedIn. I'll have to know your Twitter.